When you're eating at McDonald's, you're supporting a giant monoculture of corn and soybeans, or a horrible, stinking, brutal feedlot of beef or pork or chicken. And so that we were complicit in this landscape that we were creating, and that it was our unwillingness to cook and our desire to outsource our food preparation that was really creating this world, and that if we wanted to change it, we might need to start cooking again. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Joan, for that introduction. What Joan didn't tell you, because she's very modest, is that she is one of the very small number of absolutely indispensable teachers I've had as a writer and as a thinker about food. Her and Wendell Berry and Marion Nestle, and it's a very short list. And in fact, that 7-word haiku, eat food, not too much, mostly plants, the first 2 words she wrote. She did. I'm only adding on to that wisdom. So what I want to do tonight is a little different than what I have been doing when I've been out talking about this book, where I realized I was often talking about the argument of the book, which is very simple. The argument of the book is it's very important to cook for many reasons, and I'll touch on that. But I want to talk a little more about the experience of the book and give you a little flavor of the adventure it was to write it, because it was a really enjoyable process. It was hard to believe very often I was working as I went about learning how to cook from some wonderful masters. How I came to write it, it was never a plan of mine to write a book about cooking. Cooking seemed a little too obvious. You know, as journalists, we really like to go places people haven't been, take them to worlds they don't know anything about, and I had done that in Omnivore's Dilemma, where I took people back to the farm and showed people where their food came from, showed myself where our food came from, because it had become really obscure and kind of surprising. And then I had leapt ahead to the other end of the food chain, the body end, and looked at the question of health. And what do we know about the links between diet and health? And in both those projects, I kept getting this hint, this intuition that cooking was an important part of both stories, in this sense. The landscapes that I was seeing of feedlots, of monocultures, of corn and soy, what created them in large part was the fact that we had outsourced our food preparation to large corporations. When you're eating at McDonald's, you're supporting a giant monoculture of corn and soybeans, or a horrible, stinking, brutal feedlot of beef or pork or chicken. And so that we were complicit in this landscape that we were creating, and that it was our unwillingness to cook and our desire to outsource our food preparation that was really creating this world, and that if we wanted to change it, we might need to start cooking again. Otherwise, it was going to be very hard to change, because that's where corporations buy their food, from the largest possible, most uniform farms they can find. And then on the other end, when I started working on this question of health and looking at nutrients, good and bad, and how we kind of think of food as, eating well as like knowing what the evil nutrient is of the moment. Now it's gluten and saturated fat and trans fats. And then the blessed nutrient of the moment, which is, fiber and omega-3 fatty acids and protein. And although gluten is protein, so that's kind of confusing. And navigating between those two things. But I realized that way of eating didn't really work, and it really wasn't scientifically well-founded. And that the best indicator of a healthy diet, it turned out, was whether it was cooked by a human being or by a corporation. And that even poor people who still cooked had healthier diets than rich people who didn't. So both those things made me realize, well, there was this middle link in the food chain between the farm and the body, and that was how we prepare our food and who does it, that deserved a book of its own. So that's kind of how it got started. But I didn't want to write a cookbook. I didn't know enough about it. I wasn't a great cook who had a lot of great recipes to impart. There are only 4 recipes in this book, and they're not easy ones. I think they're pretty good, but they're not easy. what I wanted to do was kind of do a deep dive into what is cooking. I mean, just kind of peel away the crust of fanciness and pretension and complexity that surrounds cooking and so much talk about cooking, and get down to the fundamentals, if I could find them. And what I realized that at some point, with the help of my wife Judith, actually, who had this insight, was that there were these fundamental transformations at the base of all kinds of cooking, and that you could take any dish, almost, and there are exceptions you can probably think of, and reduce them to one of four transformations. Cooking is transformation, but there are different ways to transform the raw of nature into the cooked of culture. And the first was fire. And then the second was water, cooking in pots with liquid of any kind. And then there was baking, and then there was fermentation. And it was Judith who realized, you know, those kind of line up with the classical elements. Fire, water, air, because baking is about putting air into your food. And the chapter is not about seltzer. And earth is about fermentation, because earth is where these microbes live. So that became the structure. And in each section, there's kind of one recipe, and then I find some masters to teach me about how to do it. And I weave this in with lots of history and other modes that are fun to talk about. And so the first thing was fire. And I want to take you to Ayden, North Carolina. I was looking for the most, I mean, fire was a big deal for our species, as you've heard, but I think the reason it was so important, though, had more to do with the fact that it gave us cooked food. About 2 million years ago, it is estimated, humans figured out that if you cooked food, it tasted better. And not only did it taste better, but it was easier to digest. Because when you cook something, you're basically externalizing a lot of the work of digestion. You're beginning this breakdown process. The food is easier to chew and easier for your body to digest. We use a lot of metabolic energy simply digesting food. So when you have cooked food, suddenly you have access to many more calories per chew. And primates who eat raw food, primates our size who eat raw food, have very elaborate, long digestive systems, and they spend a lot of time chewing. Half their waking hours are spent chewing. You would never get anything done. And indeed, they don't get a lot done except chew. Find food and chew it. A little sex, a little sleep, but that's it. 6 hours a day. So cooking was the switch in evolution that led to the growth of these big brains that we have and the shrinking of our guts. Now, it is true we're going in the opposite direction right now. But for a long time, that was the main trend. And because our brains are huge energy guzzlers. Your brain is 2% of your body weight, and it consumes 20% of the energy you consume. And you could not support it on raw food. Raw food is take note. Now, how do raw food survive? The blender. They're very blender dependent. Without the blender, they would be doing the 6 hours of chewing a day and not getting anything done. So anyway, so I wanted to find so this was a really big deal for our species and probably explains how we kind of diverged from the line of apes we were in. And cooking gave us other things too. It gave us the occasion, the meal. Because before you cook with fire and you're a hunter-gatherer, you pretty much eat on the go and alone. Other animals don't have meals. Other animals don't cook, with one exception. And I'll tell you now, because last night I was speaking in Boston and I forgot to tell the exception, and I've been getting emails and Twitter things all day, like, what's the other animal that cooks? Well, this is arguable, but I mentioned fermentation as a kind of cooking. And squirrels who bury acorns, we think they're hiding them. No, they're cooking them. They're basically allowing them to start breaking down in the microbial fermentation of the soil, so they'll be easier to digest. And dogs that bury food, animals that bury food, are basically proto-cooks. So I'm glad I got that out of the way. So cooking also gave us the meal, because it's a cooperative activity. Someone's got to keep the fire going, and somebody's got to divvy up the meat when it's ready. And it also requires something else that you might not think about. It requires rules. Because if you think about it, if you've got this delicious big hunk of meat, and you've got all these hungry savages around, the biggest, strongest, hungriest, greediest one is going to get all of it unless you have some codes, unless you have some manners. And so around that fire, we became tamer, and we developed a lot of rules so we could share, divide the meat so the weak could have some too. And so it's a big deal, the discovery of cooking. And I would argue it's an equally big deal, the decline of cooking in our civilization today. So I wanted to learn about fire cooking, and I was looking for the place or the style that was most like classic, primitive, primal cooking with fire. And I found it in eastern North Carolina, where there is a style of barbecue that is very different than other styles of barbecue, but it's essentially whole hog barbecue, where the recipe hasn't been changed for a very long time. It's pig, wood fire, thyme, and a little salt. That's it. And it's an amazing kind of cooking. And it is, so I went looking for it, and looking for people who were doing it in the most kind of unreconstructed way. And I found that in a couple places, but the one I want to read you a short passage of was in Ayden, North Carolina, where there is a place called the Skylight Inn. It's a very interesting building in the middle of nowhere. It's about, I don't know, 45 minutes off of I-95, near the coast. And it's a kind of a pentagon with a Capitol dome on top called the Skylight Inn. And there's no skylight. There's a dome. And I asked them why, and they said, well, 1965, National Geographic said we were the capital of barbecue, and so we put a capital up. And I never got an explanation why there's no skylight. Maybe it's under the dome. Anyway, so Samuel Johnson is the owner of this restaurant. It's been around for a very long time. And he showed me around. And there's the restaurant in front where you can get a wonderful barbecue sandwich for $2.75. This is a very democratic food. But they don't cook in the restaurant because it's so dangerous. They have these buildings out back made of cinder blocks. And they're the pit room, basically. And lining each side of the wall is this big pit with a grate on top. And smoke is like coming out of the seams in this building as you walk up to it, and smells really good. And so Samuel took me to see what he called the vestibule of hell. And I'll give you a little sense of what it was like. The vestibule of hell. The pit room was, in fact, an infernal chamber, and not a place likely to stimulate an appetite for cooked pig in many people. The residues of fires, big and small, were everywhere, blackening the bricks, charring the ceiling, puckering the plywood walls. While Samuel and I talked, I could see over his left shoulder a spectral presence emerging out of the smoke, the figure of a slightly bent black man slowly pushing a wheelbarrow topped with a sheet of blood-stained plywood on which the splayed pink carcass of a hog precariously balanced. I could see the hog's eyeless head bobbing slightly on the lip of the wheelbarrow, and as it drew closer, the face of the man carefully inching it forward. It was deeply lined, leathery, and missing several teeth. Samuel introduced me to James Henry Howell, the Skylight Inn's longtime pitmaster. But Howell made it instantly clear he would be leaving all the talking to the Joneses. He had work to do. And indeed, it appeared that he did the lion's share of the physical labor performed at the restaurant. Back and forth across the pit room, Mr. Howell slowly wheeled his hogs, melting into the haze to fetch another carcass from the walk-in cooler, then emerging again with his load, which he would tenderly tip onto the iron grates. Howell worked slowly and deliberately, and when he was done putting the hogs on, he had created an arresting tableau, a smoke-dimmed conga line of splayed pink carcasses laid out skin side up and snout to butt. The interior of the cookhouse now looked like a bunk room, the sleeping hogs bedded down for the night. Of all the animals we eat, or that some of us eat, none resembles us more closely than the hog. Each the size of a grown man, hairless and pink, its mouth set in what looks very much like a sly smile. The half-dozen pigs laid out in this smoky crypt made me think of many things, but definitely not lunch or dinner. It was difficult to regard this pit room, filthy and littered with cinders, as a kitchen, but of course that is what it is. And that is why the state of North Carolina has been forced to choose between the equitable enforcement of its health codes and the survival of whole hog barbecue. Sacred local tradition that it is, barbecue has won, at least for the time being. But this is a most unusual kitchen, one where the principal cooking implements are wheelbarrows and shovels, and the pantry, such as it is, contains nothing but hogs, firewood, and salt. In fact, the entire building is a kind of cooking implement, as Samuel explained. We were inside a giant low-temperature oven for the gentle smoking of pigs. Just how tightly the cookhouse is sealed, even the pitch of its roof, all influence the way the meat cooks. Now, when I saw this scene, I didn't think I'd be able to eat this barbecue. It was a little disturbing, and there was like caked grease everywhere, and it was pretty nasty. But time heals all wounds and all disgusts. And the next day, and it takes all day, I came back, and those hog carcasses were this lacquered honey color. They were beautiful, and they smelled incredible. And so I went to the restaurant, and what they do is they take the key thing about whole hog barbecue is they mix all the parts. This is another sense in which it's a very democratic food. They don't have good parts and bad parts. They mix them all. So what they do is they take some belly, they take some ham, they take some loin, and they put it all in a chopping block, and some skin, as they pronounce it, and they chop it with 2 cleavers until it's really fine. They add a little bit of apple cider vinegar and some red pepper and some salt, and they put it on a sandwich. And it's just the best sandwich you've ever had. Because it's moist and it's got all these different textures, and it's these little shards of crackling, which is like bacon. It's full of umami and very special. So I spent some time with them and then with another pit master who showed me how to do this and how to, take the animal apart and chop it. And I learned a lot about barbecue, and I realized that the barbecue pit master and even the guy in the backyard grilling for his family is in this long tradition that goes way back to, the ancient Greeks and their rabbis, their priests and the rabbis. And the rabbis in the Old Testament. And in both cases, the rabbi was the butcher, or the priest was the butcher and the cook. And because this was a holy operation, it was sacramental. You were sacrificing to the gods. And initially, of course, we burned everything to a crisp, because that was for the gods. And then somebody got smart and said, I don't think the gods eat meat. Because if they ate meat, then they'd have to eliminate. And I think they just like smoke. And of course, that's the only way to get it up there to the heavens. So why don't we give them the smoke and we can keep the meat? And that's essentially, that was a big breakthrough for humankind. But anyway, so the person who conducts this, the pit master, the ancient Greek priest, who's called a megaros, a word that is the root of magic, and it has butcher, cook, and priest in it. They're very important figures in their communities, and there's a lot of self-dramatizing, which still attaches to barbecue. You have these men, of course, who make it look really difficult, and like, oh, I don't know if it's done yet, and I have to focus on the barbecue. I'm not going to help with the sides or cleaning up. It's just like. And women will often refuse to barbecue and say, I don't know how to do that. But I learned in the course of my research that that isn't actually true. They pretend not to know how to barbecue. It's to get men to do something. And but like a lot of activities that have a lot of self-dramatizing, it's actually very simple. It couldn't be more simple. And so there was a lot of crust on barbecue I tried to remove. So anyway, that was my adventure in North Carolina. I then I apprenticed myself to a Chez Panisse chef named Samin Nosrat to learn about cooking with liquid. This is the next big breakthrough, and it comes way after that first breakthrough of fire, which is 2 million years old. We are not cooking in pots with liquids till 10,000 years ago, because it had awaited a couple things. But basically, the invention of pottery that could withstand a fire. And that was a big deal. And it happens just around the time that agriculture is starting, which makes a lot of sense, because agriculture is largely about growing grain. and which are hard seeds, and they're very hard to eat unless you can either slow cook them for a long time, you know, think of porridge or something like that, or grind them and then soak them in water. So this is a big technology, and it helps. You wouldn't have agriculture if you didn't have this. It does a lot of things for us. For one thing, it's less wasteful than grilling over a fire because you're not losing the fat and all the calories and good taste that leave the meat with the fat. It all collects in the pot. And over time, it gives you this amazing invention called sauce, which, of course, you don't have until you have these pots. But it also does something else interesting, which is it extends the human lifespan. And the reason it does that is because now you can wean babies earlier because you've got something you can feed them that doesn't require teeth, and you can keep old people alive longer because you can make food that doesn't require teeth. Before that, when you lost your teeth, you were kind of screwed. And so it was a real boon. So I learned about braises, and I worked with Samin and had a wonderful time learning about home cooking. And this is the part of the book where I talk about what happened to cooking, why don't we have time to do it, and what's lost when we don't cook. And along the way, we were cooking a lot. And my son Isaac and my wife Judith, we were all involved. We were in the kitchen. Samin would come over every Sunday, and it'd be this 4-hour thing, and we'd make some big meal and invite friends over. And Isaac got a little tired of it at a certain point, and he came up with this idea: could we have a night off from cooking and maybe just go to the supermarket and get a frozen meal? And I thought, this could be good for the book. So I said, sure. So this scene describes our microwave night. So the next afternoon after school, Isaac was like in 9th or 10th grade. We drove to the Safeway, grabbed a shopping cart, and wheeled it down the long, chilly aisle of freezer cases holding the microwavable dinners. The choices were stupendous, almost stupefying, in fact. It took us more than 20 minutes just to decide among the bags of frozen Chinese stir-fry, the boxed Indian biryanis and curries, the fish and chip dinner, the multi-flavored mac and cheese options, the Japanese gyoza and Indonesian satay, the Thai rice bowls, the old-timey Salisbury steaks, the roast turkey and fried chicken dinners, the beef stroganoff, the burritos and tacos and fully loaded heroes sandwiches, the frozen garlic bread and sliders, and the cheeseburgers pre-installed on their frozen buns. There were whole product lines targeted at women trying to minimize their caloric intake, and others at men looking to maximize theirs. And still others aimed at kids dreaming of an authentic fast food restaurant experience at home. I hadn't spent much time on this aisle in years, so had no idea just how many advances there had been in the technology of home meal replacement. That's what these things are called. It's a wonderful term. Every genre of fast food, every ethnic cuisine, every chain restaurant menu item known to man in commerce now has its facsimile in the freezer case. Judith was willing to go along with our dinner plans, but declined to join us shopping for it. She had requested a frozen lasagna, and Isaac spotted a bright red box of Stouffer's that looked halfway appetizing. Dubious about eating meat under the circumstances, I first checked out a vegan chicken cacciatore entree, but the lengthy list of ingredients, most of them ultra-processed permutations of soy, put me off the mock meat. So I opted for an organic vegetable curry from Amy's that seemed fairly straightforward in composition. At least I recognized all the ingredients as food, which is saying a lot in this sector of the supermarket. Isaac agonized for a good long time, but his problem was the opposite of mine. There were just too many tempting entrees he wanted to try. Eventually, it came down to a call between the bag of P.F. Chang's Shanghai-style beef stir-fry and Safeway's own frozen onion soup gratinée. I told him he could get them both, as well as some frozen molten chocolate cookie he'd been eyeing for dessert. The total for the three of us came to $27, more than I would have expected. Some of the entrees, like Isaac's stir-fry, promised to feed more than one person, but this seemed doubtful given the portion size. Later that week, I went to the farmer's market and found that with $27, I could easily buy a couple pounds of an inexpensive cut of grass-fed beef and enough vegetables to make a braise that would feed the three of us for at least one night and probably two. So there was a price to pay for letting the team of P.F. Chang's, Stouffer's, Safeway's, and Amy's cook our dinner. I don't think it's boastful of me to say that none of these entrees did anything to undermine my growing confidence in the kitchen. True, I don't yet know how to engineer dishes that can withstand months in the freezer case, or figure out how to build little brown ice cubes of hoisin sauce designed to liquefy just in time to coat the vegetables after they've defrosted, but not a moment sooner. And nothing I learned from Samin could help me design the consecutive layers of cheese curds and croutons topping the chocolate-colored cylinder of frozen onion soup like a Don King fright wig. So how did it all taste? A lot like airline food, if you can remember what that was like. All the entrees tasted remarkably similar, considering how far-flung the culinary inspirations. They were all salty and had that generic fast food flavor, a sort of bouillon-y taste that probably can be traced to the hydrolyzed vegetable protein that several of the dishes contained. This is ingredient label euphemism for monosodium glutamate, MSG, basically a cheap way to boost the perception of umami in a food. The dishes all tasted better on the first bite, when you might be tempted to think, hey, not half bad, than on the second or third, when those words would be unlikely to cross your mind. There is a short half-life to the taste of a frozen dinner, which I would peg somewhere around bite number 3, after which the whole experience rapidly deteriorates. Oh, but wait, I've skipped over the cooking or not cooking segment of our meal, which you probably assumed, as I certainly did, would be nominal and so not worth going into in this account. That is, after all, the reason people buy these frozen dinners in the first place, isn't it? Well, if it is, they're sorely mistaken, because it took nearly an hour to get our entrees onto the table. For one thing, you could only microwave one of them at a time, and we had 4 to defrost and heat, not counting the molten frozen cookie. Also, one of the packages warned that we would not get optimal results in the microwave. The various stages that make up the frozen brown rocket of onion soup would meld together pointlessly in the microwave. If we wanted the gratin effect promised on the package, then we had to bake it in the oven at 350 degrees for 40 minutes. I could make onion soup from scratch in 40 minutes. Isaac didn't want to wait that long, so we ended up taking turns standing in front of the microwave. Is there any more futile, soul-irradiating experience than standing before the little window on a microwave oven, watching the carousel slowly revolve your frozen block of dinner? Time spent this way might be easier than cooking, but it is not enjoyable and surely not ennobling. It is to feel spiritually unemployed, useless to self and humanity. I'm a little hard on the microwave. It's really good for reheating a cup of tea. Anyway, as soon as the first dish was hot, we swapped it out for the second. But by the time the fourth entree was hot enough to eat, the first one had gotten cold and needed renuking. Isaac finally asked permission to start eating his onion soup before it got cold again. The advent of the microwave has not been a boon to table manners. He was already down to the bottom of his bowl when Judith's lasagna emerged from the oven. Microwave night turned out to be one of the most disjointed family dinners we have had since Isaac was a toddler. The 3 of us never quite got to sit down at the table all at once. The best we could manage was to overlap for several minutes at a time, since one or another of us was constantly having to get up to check the microwave or the stovetop, where Isaac had moved to stir-fry after the microwave got backed up. All told, the meal took a total of 37 minutes to defrost and heat up, not counting all the reheating, easily enough time to make a respectable homemade dinner. It made me think Harry Balzer, who's this market researcher who's a character in the book, might be right to attribute the triumph of this kind of eating to laziness and a lack of skills or confidence, or a desire to eat lots of different things, rather than to a genuine lack of time. That we hadn't saved much of at all. The fact that each of us was eating something different completely altered the experience of, speaking loosely, eating together. Beginning in the supermarket, the food industry has cleverly segmented us by marketing a different kind of food to each demographic in the household, if I may so refer to my family, the better to sell us more of it. Individualism is always good for sales, sharing much less so. But the segmentation continued through the serial microwaving and the unsynchronized eating. At the table, we were each preoccupied with our own entree, making sure it was hot and trying to decide how successfully it simulated the dish it purported to be, and if we really liked it. Very little about this meal was shared. The single-serving portions served to disconnect us from one another nearly as much as from the origins of this food, which, beyond the familiar logos, we could only guess at. Microwave night was a notably individualistic experience marked by centrifugal energies, a certain opaqueness, and after it was all over, a remarkable quantity of trash. It was, in other words, a lot like modern life. So that was our experiment in not cooking. And I'm making the point that you really have to look at how much time it takes to cook compared to the alternatives of ordering in, waiting for the food to come, going to the restaurant, nuking the microwaves, and you have to do your own time assessment. So after home cooking, I wanted to learn how to bake. And this brought me to the door of my questions have arrived. Thank you. Oh, you're collecting them. Okay, I don't take them from you yet. Good, I have a few more minutes. Because I want to talk to you about baking, quickly. So baking is the next great innovation in food technology. And it comes about 6,000 years ago. And it's a big deal for this reason. And I got this insight from a food scientist at Davis who told me, you know, if I gave you a bag of flour, even whole wheat flour, and water, you could not live on that very long. You would die eventually. That's not enough food to live on. But if you took that same flour and water and turned it into bread, you could live indefinitely. So how was that? What an amazing transformation. How does that happen? Well, what happens is, I mean, flour is just seeds ground up. And seeds are designed not for us, but to feed the next generation of a plant. So they lock up their nutrients. They lock up their minerals, carbohydrates, proteins in these long chains that are very hard to break down, and we can't digest them very efficiently. But if we ferment them, if we introduce a sourdough culture, which is basically just this little ecosystem of bacteria and yeasts, they go to work, breaking down the long chains, amino acids and carbohydrates into short sugars. And so that starts the process of making it more digestible. And then when you bake it, an even more amazing thing happens, which is that, you know, if you're cooking something in a pot, you can only get it up to the boiling point, right? But if you cook a loaf of bread, it forms its own pressure cooker. The crust is a pressure cooker. And inside there, all those little holes that Joan described that can be broken by the shards of bran, those holes form steam in the oven. And the steam can get much hotter than the boiling point. It can go to 400 degrees, 500 degrees. And that changes the starch structure, making it very digestible. So the difference between bread and porridge is huge. And this transformation, which probably was discovered by accident in some bowl of porridge that just started bubbling that somebody put in the oven and saw, wow, this is getting bigger, was a big deal. And so I wanted to learn how to do this, how to make a sourdough bread. And I spent some time in a Wonder Bread factory, but I also spent some time with a wonderful baker in San Francisco named Chad Robertson, who has a bakery called Tartine. And his bread is the best I've ever had. And if you get to San Francisco, try to go there. It's in the Mission. The bread doesn't come out of the oven until 5 in the afternoon, though, so don't get there early. And the reason is he's a surfer. And so he, you know, it's San Francisco. The sense of urgency is different. He only makes like 200 loaves a day, but they're sublime. And so I wanted to work with him, and he was kind enough to let me work several shifts with him and share his secrets. Now, the big secret for a baker, I thought going in, was their sourdough starter. And I had to make one. And I thought, God, wouldn't it be great to have some Tartine sourdough starter? But I didn't know what the etiquette was of asking a baker for something that's so central to the identity of his bread, so I didn't even think about asking. But I did shake his hand whenever I had a chance, hoping to pick up some microbes. And as this brief scene where he talks to me about his starter will show, I had a few other tricks up my sleeve. Thank you very much. That's it? 3 questions? All right, I'm going to keep talking. Chad Robertson looks less a baker than the surfer he also is. He has a swimmer's long, sleek torso and a certain litheness about him. Chad is equally economical with his words, his movements, and his smiles. On my first visit to the bakery, I spent an hour watching him shape petards. He wore a white apron tied tightly around his waist, a visor over his brown hair shaded his brown eyes. The process is mesmerizing to watch, but impossible to follow. To break it down into discrete, comprehensible, imitable steps. All I could make out was a blur of dexterous fingers that looked as if they were swaddling an endless succession of infants at warp speed. While he shaped loaves, we talked. I asked Chad about his starter. I had brought mine along in a Tupperware container, hoping to pick up some pointers on care and feeding, and, secretly perhaps, some good microbes as well, since I figured the bakery must be crawling with them. When I was starting out, I was superstitious about my starter, Chad told me as he swiftly cut and weighed lumps of dough. I would take it on vacation because I didn't trust anyone with it. Actually, in San Francisco now, there is a starter hotel where for a day rate, you can pay them to take care of your starter. It has to be fed every day. I'm not a patron of the sourdough hotel. Once, I took it to the movies with me so I could feed it exactly on time. I'm more relaxed about it now. I tend to think it's less about nature than nurture, meaning roughly that the requisite bugs or microbes are everywhere, but can be selected and trained by the baker to perform as he wants them to. Chad showed me his culture, taking down from a high, warm shelf a metal bowl half filled with an animated white soup. It was wetter and warmer than mine and smelled less sour. He told a story about the night one of his apprentices, cleaning the bakery at the end of her shift, accidentally threw out the bowl of starter. "I cried," he said. "I thought I was finished as a baker. But then I found I was able to start a new culture within a couple of days that smelled exactly like the old one." Chad judges the starter by its aroma, which in his view should be more fruity than vinegary. In fact, he doesn't like his sourdough to be very sour at all. Sour is easy to achieve, just don't feed the starter as often, he said, but it's one-dimensional. Chad figures that by now the right yeasts and bacteria are all over his bakery and easy enough to capture. Though he also recently had experiences starting new cultures while in France and Mexico that soon came to smell and perform much like his culture in San Francisco. This has led him to the conclusion that the feeding schedule and the ambient temperature are the most important factors determining the character of a sourdough culture. But it could also be that by now, Chad Robertson carries some really good bugs on his person. Which is why before I left the bakery that evening, I opened my Tupperware to the tartine air and asked him to pronounce on the quality of my culture. Chad raised the container to his nose, sniffed, and nodded in mild approval. And it did get much better after that. And so did my baking. So anyway, go by his bakery, bring your starter. So the last section of the book, to me, was kind of, in some ways, the most thrilling. And that is fermentation. Now, there is fermentation in bread, but there's another kind of fermentation where you never use heat. And you transform food simply by the action of microbes. It's kind of miraculous. I'm talking about how we make cheese, how we make sauerkraut and kimchi, how we make beer and wine and mead and all these kind of things. And that this is a very old kind of cooking. It probably goes way beyond, it's much earlier than bread or cooking with pots. But it was really the only way to preserve food before refrigeration. Well, you could dry it also, or salt it. But fermentation was the best way to preserve the nutrients in food, because when you ferment a vegetable, say, basically what's happening is, and it's very easy to do, you just say if you want to make sauerkraut, you just dice make a coleslaw cut of your cabbage, add salt until it tastes salted but not salty, which is a somewhat individual thing, but that's a good guideline. Put in some carrots if you want, some caraway seeds or dill seeds or whatever, and then you're done. You put it in a crock, press down on it so the water, which will come out of the cabbage, covers it, and in a few days it will start bubbling. You don't have to introduce a culture. And that's because there are lactobacillus everywhere. They're covering the cabbage, they're covering you, and they're just waiting for you to die and start fermenting you. And no, it's true. And they're doing the same with the cabbage. And so this ecological succession takes place. One lactobacillus starts digesting the sugars in the vegetable. It makes a more and more acidic environment till it dies. And then a more acid-tolerant one comes along. And there's this, it's like a succession in a forest until you have this climax species that stabilizes the whole thing. And then you have sauerkraut. And it's full of vitamin C and nutrients that didn't even exist before, like B12, that are made by the microbes. So I learned about that from Sander Katz, who's, if you want to read about fermentation, his book, The Art of Fermentation, is really the Bible. But then, and this is what I want to end on, is tell you a little bit about a cheesemaker I worked with named Sister Noella. She's a nun at an abbey in Bethlehem, Connecticut. And she makes a cheese, it's a Connecticut version of Saint-Nectaire, which comes from the Auvergne in France. And on her abbey, they had cows and they had a surplus of milk. This is how cheesemaking gets started. They wanted to preserve it. And so this woman came from the Auvergne and taught her how to make a very traditional cheese. So traditional that the recipe included a wooden barrel and a wooden stirrer, and which is just terrifying to any kind of public health official. And the instructions in the traditional recipe are, don't wash the barrel, just rinse it lightly. And there's a white scum in the barrel. And in fact, she got in hot water with the health inspector, who came and said, look, you got to use stainless steel, which is our kind of symbol of food safety, is stainless steel. And she was convinced, though, that this raw milk cheese was safer made in a wooden barrel, and she set up a test. She had a degree in microbiology, I need to point out. And she set up a test, and the Abbey had actually sent her to get her degree in microbiology to defend her cheese. And she went to the University of Connecticut at Storrs and got a PhD. But she did this test as part of her coursework. And so she took some raw milk, she put some in a stainless steel vat, and she put some more in the wooden barrel, and she deliberately inoculated it with E. coli, both of them. Waited 4 hours, and then they tested them. And the vat in the stainless steel, that milk was absolutely lethal. It just had very high levels of E. coli. It would be condemned instantly. But weirdly enough, or not so weirdly, the wooden barrel milk had vanishingly small amounts of E. coli. How could that be? Well, what happened is the bacteria, the lactobacilli, living in the nooks and cranny of the wood, had begun to digest the lactose, as their name suggests, their favorite food, in the milk, turning it into lactic acid, which acidified the milk and killed the E. coli. So you realize the people in the Auvergne have been practicing a kind of folk microbiology for hundreds of years without even knowing it. And that's kind of one of the, that's an example of the wisdom of food traditions. So I'm not saying you should make your cheese in a barrel, because everything has to work together. But so Sister Noella taught me a lot, and she taught me a lot about the meaning of cheese too. She loves cheese. She thinks cheese should be in the Eucharist. I know, this is probably heretical. But if you think about it, what is in the Eucharist are two fermented things, right? Bread and wine. And it makes sense, because they're about transformations, and in the case of bread, creating something that almost didn't exist before. But she thinks cheese is a better reminder of our mortality than bread is, because it gets old and it gets stinky and then it eventually, dies. And I got her to talk to me about something I couldn't get a lot of commercial cheesemakers to talk about, which is disgust and cheeses that have a really kind of rank smell. And why do some of us like that? So I want to read a brief passage about disgust, which you probably don't expect to find in a book about food. But I think it's actually important. So I had told her I was reading some philosopher on disgust, and he'd used this phrase, the erotics of disgust. And I'd mentioned this to her, and she says, oh, I really like that term, Sister Noella said, when I raised as delicately as I could the issue of rankness in her cheese. The subject of disgust is not something I found many cheesemakers eager to discuss, at least not in the company of journalists. But Sister Noella is happy to talk about the earthier dimensions of her work, at least up to a point. Cheese is all about the dark side of life, she said one afternoon as we were strolling up the hill to her lab. She told me about a French cheesemaker of her acquaintance, a monk by the name of Frère Nathaniel, who makes a strong cheese called Tamier at his monastery in the Haute-Savoie. She once asked him how he determined when a Tamier is ripe. You turn it over and sniff the bottom, Frère Nathaniel told her. Ça sent la vache. It's ready when it smells like the cow. And then in case that wasn't quite clear enough, he added, the back end of the cow. It suddenly dawned on me that barnyardy, a term cheesemongers use in praise of certain stinky cheeses, is a euphemism for manure. Duh. Certainly the manure of some farm animals, such as cows, is not unappealing, at least when they've been out grazing on pasture. Yet some cheeses make even less socially acceptable illusions, if that's the right word. The various aromas of wash-rind cheeses are often likened to those of the human body in its various parts. A French poet famously referred to the aroma of certain cheeses as the pied de Dieu, the feet of God. Just to be clear, foot odor of a particularly exalted quality, but still foot odor. Sister Noella told me about another cheesemaker friend of hers, James Stillwagon, an American living in France who holds unusually frank views on the subject of cheese olfaction. She had recently quoted him at the end of the draft of an article on the microbiology of cheese rinds, though she wasn't sure if his remarks would survive editing. The quote came from an exchange the two had had on the question of why the vocabulary used to describe wine is so much richer and more nuanced than the vocabulary used to describe cheese. Wine talk is full of vivid metaphor, comparing wines to specific fruits and flowers, for example, whereas, as Stillwagon pointed out, the flavor of cheese usually elicits only vague, generalized comments like, good, interesting, fantastic. And this is what he wrote. If we address frankly what is evoked by cheese, I think it becomes clear why so little is said. So what does cheese evoke? Damp, dark cellars, molds, mildews, and mushrooms galore, dirty laundry and high school locker rooms, digestive processes and visceral fermentations, he-goats, which do not remind us of Chanel. In sum, cheese reminds of dubious, even unsavory places, both in nature and in our own organisms, and yet we love it. In its very suggestiveness, cheese is both like and unlike many of the other foods humans cook or ferment. Whether by fire or water or the action of microbes, one of the ways humans transform the edible stuff of nature is in the direction of a greater elusiveness in taste or smell or appearance. Just as we take pleasure in enriching our language with layers of metaphor and allusion, we apparently like to trope what we eat and drink too, extracting from it not only more nourishment, but more meaning as well, more psychic nourishment, if you will. It just so happens that the more vivid, odoriferous tropes that cheesemakers have teased out of milk converge on the indecent, taking us places polite society doesn't like to go. But I said it's an illusion, and I always thought pied de deux was an allusion to the smell of feet, but it's actually more literal than that, because the B. linens, the Brevibacteria linens, which is the bacteria on a washed rind cheese that makes it kind of stinky, happens to be almost identical to the bacteria that exists between your toes. So is this an allusion to the body, or is this just a reminder of the body? Anyway, that's a very curious thing about that. And sweat doesn't really have a smell. More, good, thank you. Okay, good. Sweat doesn't really have a smell, but once it's been fermented by B. linens, or Brevibacteria, it begins to smell. So I'm going to leave it there, and because now I have some questions. Although the first three, I should, thoughts on Mark Bittman's article about not focusing on GMO labeling? That's interesting. Did people see this piece? He had an opinionator story in which he said two things that annoyed some people in the food movement. I have to say they didn't annoy me particularly, but he said we shouldn't be obsessing about a couple things we obsess about. One is organic, and that he argued that you can have a very healthy diet without necessarily buying organic or local food. You just have to buy real food and cook it. I think it's a very good point, and it gets overlooked. And the other is, has the food movement spent too much time on this fight over GMO labeling? I think it's really important to label GMOs. I think we have a right to know what's in our food, and whether it's safe or not. We have no reason to believe it's not safe, although I hasten to add, you would be amazed at how little testing has been done to assure that it is safe. So we need to test it, we need to regulate it. But think about it this way, as Mark says in this column, let's say we succeeded in getting GM crops prohibited, banned. Where would we be? Would this be a great victory for the food movement? Politically, it might be. It would show strength. But in terms of American agriculture, you would essentially be just turning the clock back to 1995, before they were introduced, which is not a golden age for agriculture. It's chemically intensive. It's still monoculture. So, I thought he made good points. I think it was an important thing for the food movement to discuss. I don't watch enough Star Trek to answer that one. Don't understand that one. In what ways, if at all, has your Jewish heritage influenced your approach to food? Well, you have one inclination. I have a pig named Kosher once. And I don't think if I hadn't been Jewish, my pig would have been named Kosher. I think in all sorts of ways, actually. I mean, I've talked about the kosher rules before, which I think are really interesting, and I think having rules, as I said earlier, having rules around meat eating is a really good thing, whatever they are. I think it should be approached with a certain sense of ceremony and deliberateness, because it's our thoughtlessness about eating meat that I think is getting us into trouble. And there's all, I mean, it's part of my food tradition. They're Jewish foods, and so it definitely has influenced me. But I don't keep kosher. This book explains what you like to cook if you have a lot of time. But what's your favorite dinner that can be made in under an hour? Well, I'm going to give you a dinner, kind of a dinner that we fall back on in my house in much less than that. We get home late from something like this, and but we don't have any, we haven't eaten out. So I always have in my pantry some dried pasta, whole wheat pasta, and I always have in my fridge frozen spinach, sometimes organic, sometimes not. And I always have in my pantry cans of wild salmon. And with those three things and a little olive oil, and maybe some garlic or not, maybe some herbs or not, you can make a beautiful pasta dish, one dish thing. And it takes 20 minutes. I think one of the secrets to cooking quickly and well is stocking your pantry so that there are things there when you decide you want to cook that you can make a meal from. And again, are those processed foods? Yeah, they are, but they're not hyper-processed foods. They're convenience foods, and they are very convenient. And there's, so that's an example. You keep bringing up new ways we keep revolutionizing the way we cook food in this history. What's your response to Soylent, this liquid concoction of basic nutritional components that replaces the meal and is getting way too much attention? I actually added the last few words. Is that still food? Well, there was this article in the New Yorker last week about Soylent, and it's this tech guy who's, had no patience with cooking and no patience even with eating, and he just wanted to find a really quick way so he could be alive and still code. And so he went online and he got found out from the USDA or whatever nutritional authorities are out there what you need to live. And he ordered those nutrients over the internet and mixed them in a powder that you add water to. And it will keep you alive, though no one's tried it very long. The problem with that idea, well, one problem with that idea, there are a lot of problems with that idea. He's assuming that pleasure takes no place in this as an experience of eating or an experience of cooking. Okay. But like infant formula, it's predicated on the idea that we can simulate real food. And we have failed over and over and over again. If you look at the history of infant formula, and that really is the model for this, you will find that over and over again we felt we'd nailed down what you needed. First in the 1840s, oh, you just need fat, carbohydrates, protein. And we did that, and we gave it to babies, and they died. Why? Well, we didn't have the right kinds of fats. We didn't know you needed omega-3 fats. We didn't know you needed different kinds of fats. And so then we started, and we didn't have vitamins. We didn't know about vitamins. So 100 years goes by, we realized we got to put vitamins and then omega-3s in infant formula, and it's still the babies don't do as well as babies on mother's milk. What else is missing? Well, only in the last few years we found a big thing that was missing that we didn't realize. We had figured out what you needed to feed the body, the human baby, but we didn't figure out what something called oligosaccharides, which are sugars. Like 40% of infant formula are these sugars called oligosaccharides that the baby can't digest. And they don't know why, because the baby doesn't have an enzyme to digest it. But there it was. And they just discarded it and never tried to put that in formula. But it turns out that mother's milk has food not just for the baby, but for the microbes that live in the baby's gut. And so the oligosaccharides encourage the growth of a certain kind of bacteria called bifidobacteria, which you've seen in yogurt and things like that, that is absolutely essential for the child's health. So now we'll add that, and then we'll figure out the next thing. So the point is there's a certain human hubris in thinking we can simulate what real food does. And this is the kind of reductivist approach that is, I think, bound to fail. Okay. Time for one or two more. Well, this will be fast. I work in healthcare. What is a short message that I can share with my patients about healthy eating, people who are poorly educated and live in food deserts? Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. I mean, it really is. It really is simple. You have to know what food is. The opposite of food are edible food-like substances. And essentially, if you avoid edible food-like substances. Food deserts are an issue. It's been really overplayed, though. There's a lot of research suggesting that there is food available in the inner city. There are supermarkets. And supermarkets are full of both good and bad food. So we do need to work on access to fresh, healthy food. But as I said, you know, frozen food is fine. Frozen spinach is a great food. Sorry, you have to watch me read these. I want a good one. Another one on Soylent. That really got people's attention. And the headline was "The End of Food." I don't think that's going to happen. Can't read the typewriting. What do you eat when you're stuck at the airport? Eating on the road is really hard. This isn't really on the road because my family's here and I'm eating with my family, but eating in airports is really challenging. So I have a simple rule: no meat in airports. I don't eat meat in airports. And if I have to eat a meal in an airport, I look for the burrito stand. And usually you can get like a rice and beans burrito that's, you know, pretty good. You asked, or one of you asked. I didn't feel I had to share that. What are some of the most memorable meals from your childhood, and why are they significant? Well, that's a good one, because my mom's here. I was very fortunate. I grew up in a household where we had family dinner most nights. We did get to have our TV dinners on the weekend, and I loved them. And we had Chinese food on Sundays. But during the week, there was always a meal, and it was always on the table at 6 o'clock, and it was usually wonderful. My mom was a very obliging chef. She had things she liked to make, but if we came home and said we'd had something really good at school lunch, like chicken fried steak or Salisbury steak, I mean, these horrors that we kind of liked, she would work very hard to make them for us. And they never quite lived up to... but there's so many things she makes that are wonderful. I mean, her Thanksgiving dinner is incredible and always memorable. What's great about my mom's cooking, too, is it's not frozen in time. She's not making what she made when I was a kid, and she's not making what she had, thank God, when she was growing up. Now, they ate a lot of weird organs, and they ate, I remember she told me, udders of cows and things like that. So I'm very fortunate in that I have, you know, a head full of memorable meals, although I don't eat many of them anymore. Sorry, a lot of questions about kosher. Not the pig. So this is if you could gather all the energy of the food movement and direct it toward one issue, what would it be? In other words, is there an issue you think could actually move quickly if hypothetically we all focused on it? I think one really important issue is, and this is going to seem a little narrow, but it actually isn't, is the use of antibiotics in raising animals. We've known for 20 years that that is a really stupid thing to do, to give lots of these precious antibiotics to animals to just make them grow faster, or allow them to live in their, you know, these brutal conditions. And the FDA has just punted on this issue over and over and over again. And there was a court decision recently that said, you've got to deal with this issue. The public health community is unified. This is a bad idea. It's not a necessary idea. In Europe, they've stopped doing it in many countries without a lot of trouble. But I think if we removed antibiotics in livestock, you would see that the whole feedlot system, it wouldn't collapse, but it would have to be made a lot more humane. You would have to reduce the concentration. You would have to reduce the stress and the brutality. You would have to reduce the filth of these places. And that would be a huge benefit to us because you wouldn't have these antibiotic-resistant microbes which are coming off of these feedlots and sickening people now. And it would be very good for the animals as well. The Obama administration recently announced, finally, their policy on this, and it was kind of disappointing. Margaret Hamburg, who used to work at the mayor's office in New York, is the FDA commissioner, and when she got into office, she told someone that I know, we're going to treat this issue of antibiotics in livestock as if our hair is on fire. Well, somebody put out the fire because they came forward with a voluntary program to get antibiotics out of livestock. So we'll see. We'll see if it works. Keep an eye on that. And if it doesn't, I think we have to raise hell. I'm going to leave it there. And thank you so much for your attention and your good questions. Thank you. I'd be happy to sign your book and meet you there. Thank you.